There is this really specific, just a deeply intoxicating illusion that humanity spent the late 19th and early 20th centuries carefully constructing.
Oh, you mean the illusion of absolute, unquestionable dominion over the physical world?
Exactly. Think about the psychological state of the globe coming out of the Industrial Revolution, right?
Yeah.
And then plunging straight into the crucible of the First World War.
Right, because we had mastered the internal combustion engine at that point.
Yeah.
We had learned how to forge steel alloys that could just withstand unimaginable pressures.
Yeah, we had developed ballistics, artillery, mechanized warfare that was literally capable of flattening entire mountainsides, erasing ancient forests in a single afternoon.
And so we looked at the raw, chaotic, ancient mechanics of the natural world, and a collective decision was made that we had finally conquered it.
Right, nature was no longer viewed as an unpredictable adversary. It was merely a resource, something waiting to be managed, subjugated, and just optimized by human engineering.
But see, that assumption relies on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the natural world actually is.
How so?
Well, we like to tell ourselves this comforting narrative where human engineering operates on a higher, a more sophisticated plane of existence than biology.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, the prevailing philosophy of that era was that if you apply enough organized, systematic violence, or if you enough bureaucratic strategy to bear on a problem, the Earth just has no choice but to surrender.
Right, but nature is not an opposing army.
Exactly. It does not follow the Geneva Conventions. It doesn't care about your supply lines, your political treaties, or, the mathematical precision of a rapid-fire machine gun.
So when you bring rigid mechanical solutions to a fluid biological reality, you are setting the stage for a profound and deeply humiliating awakening.
Completely.
Put yourself in a hypothetical scenario for a second. You take the absolute pinnacle of human military technology, weapons explicitly designed to tear through human flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency.
And you deploy them against an adversary that simply refuses to acknowledge the rules of warfare.
Exactly. You bring a mathematical equation to a hurricane. You try to negotiate with a biological imperative using high-caliber ammunition.
It is staggering. The hubris of believing that organized military doctrine can just override a pure, unadulterated survival instinct.
It forces a reckoning. What actually happens when the unstoppable force of human industrial warfare meets an immovable biological object?
What happens when a species that has survived on a continent for millions of years is suddenly confronted by the finest weaponry the British Empire has to offer?
Welcome to the episode. Together we turn knowledge into real results. Today, we are setting our sights on the wheat belt of Western Australia in the year 1932.
A fascinating time and place.
It really is. We are unpacking one of the most surreal, almost hallucinatory military engagements in recorded human history.
It's a story about the limits of state power, really,
Yeah.
and the sheer resilience of the natural world.
Right, and the spectacular failure of applying human military logic to a complex ecological crisis.
I mean, it sounds like a piece of absurdist fiction, like a satirical play or something.
Yeah, yet the documentation is absolute. The parliamentary records, the military debriefs, the newsreels, they all confirm this actually happened.
So put yourself in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Australian outback in 1932. You are a destitute farmer. You have been pushed to the absolute limits of physical and mental endurance.
Crushed by international debt, right?
Exactly. And seemingly abandoned by the very government you fought a war for just a decade prior.
You are so entirely bereft of options that you look out over your failing crops and feel compelled to call down the full, mechanized might of the national military.
Not to repel a foreign invasion force, mind you.
No, you are begging the federal government to deploy the army to save you from a flock of birds.
It is just wildly surreal to think about.
To even begin to comprehend how a modern nation authorizes the deployment of military artillery against avians, we have to look at the crucible in which this entire conflict was forged.
Right. The roots of this absurdity do not begin in 1932.
No, they begin in 1918. Following the armistice of the First World War, the Australian government, alongside a lot of allied nations, faced a monumental domestic crisis.
How to reintegrate thousands of profoundly traumatized, exhausted soldiers back into a civilian society that had, well, entirely moved on.
And the solution the government devised was the soldier settlement scheme.
Okay, wait, break that down for a second. How does that actually work in practice?
So, under this federal initiative, Over 5,000 discharged veterans were granted parcels of land in the remote frontiers of Western Australia, places like Campion, Chandler, and Walgalan.
And what was the mandate?
The mandate handed to these men was seemingly straightforward. Take this virgin land, clear it of scrub, plant vast fields of wheat, and construct a prosperous new life.
Hold on, we need to stop and look at the underlying mechanics of that policy. Why? Why would a government take thousands of men who have just survived the absolute meat grinder of trench warfare at places like Gallipoli or the Somme and isolate them on agriculturally marginal, historically drought-prone land?
It does seem counterintuitive, right?
What are the hidden implications here? Because on the surface, the state sells this as a hero's reward, a grand patriotic opportunity for land ownership.
Right.
But when you examine the soil quality, the lack of infrastructure, and the sheer isolation, it begins to look remarkably like a government cynically offloading an economic and social burden.
Yeah, you have thousands of men with severe physical and psychological trauma.
And instead of providing complex urban reintegration, the state just exiles them to the outback and tasks them with performing a literal miracle on hostile terrain.
Well, the government was facing its own massive pressures. The national economy required a huge boost in agricultural exports to stabilize post-war debts.
And they had a surplus of unemployed, potentially restive young men.
Exactly. By handing over uncleared, remote acreage, the government was essentially demanding that these veterans conquer the outback through sheer force of will.
And the physical reality of that demand cannot be overstated.
These men were out there with hand tools, axes, and perhaps a horse if they were lucky, hacking away at dense, ancient scrubland under a blistering sun.
They were building their own rudimentary shelters, digging their own wells, trying to coax a commercial wheat yield out of soil that had never been farmed in human history.
The psychological resilience required to do that after surviving a world war is unfathomable.
They were at war with the landscape itself. And remarkably, they were actually winning.
Yeah, inch by inch, acre by acre, they bent the environment to their will. They established functioning, yielding wheat farms where there had previously been only wilderness.
But agriculture is not an isolated endeavor. It is inextricably tethered to the vast, invisible web of the global market.
Right, you can win the battle against the soil, but you cannot outfarm macroeconomic collapse.
And that collapse arrived in 1929.
The Wall Street crash sent devastating shockwaves across the Atlantic, through Europe, and straight into the Australian agricultural sector.
Global demand just evaporated overnight.
The price of wheat, the sole commodity these veterans relied upon to survive and pay their state-issued debts, plummeted to catastrophic, historic lows.
So the men who had poured their blood, sweat, and sanity into this marginal land suddenly found themselves holding harvests that cost more to reap than they could even sell them for.
Put yourself in the center of that economic pressure cooker.
Yeah, how does the political apparatus respond when its most vulnerable, heavily indebted citizens suddenly face systemic financial ruin due to forces entirely outside their control?
Well, the political response was a masterclass in empty promises.
Unsurprising, but how so?
The Prime Minister at the time, James Scullin, observed the growing panic in the wheat belt. Instead of advising the farmers to cut their losses, he aggressively urged them to double down.
Right, he told them to plant more.
Yes. He toured the regions, promising that the federal government would implement a robust financial subsidy system. He essentially guaranteed a minimum price for their wheat to ensure they wouldn't face foreclosure.
He told them to work harder, plant more acreage, and the state would catch them if they fell.
So, these desperate men listened. They stretched their already emaciated resources, took on further debt to buy seed, and planted record crops.
And then let me guess, the political winds shifted.
Oh, completely. Scullin's government fell. The new Prime Minister, Joseph Lyons, assumed office and immediately looked at the national ledger.
And he canceled the promised subsidies entirely.
Yep. The safety net was cut before anyone even had a chance to jump.
Consider the physics of that situation for a second. Imagine a structural foundation placed under immense, sustained load.
Okay, yeah.
You have these veterans already bearing the heavy, invisible burden of combat trauma. You physically isolate them in a punishing environment. You mandate backbreaking manual labor to clear the land.
The pressure is already huge.
Then you apply the crushing, inescapable weight of an unprecedented global depression. Finally, the state introduces the psychological torture of a promised lifeline, encourages the farmers to take on maximum risk, and then coldly retracts that lifeline at the 11th hour.
The structural integrity of these communities was failing.
A breaking point was no longer a theoretical possibility. Mathematically, it was inevitable. The pressure was going to blow a valve. The only unknown variable was what specific event would act as the catalyst.
And the catalyst did not come from a bank. It did not come from the parliament. It came from the deep interior of the continent, driven by a biological cycle much older than human agriculture.
A severe, prolonged drought.
Exactly. It was ravaging the inland regions of Western Australia. And this brutal lack of water triggered a massive, desperate migration of an estimated 20,000 emus.
They were moving steadily from the parched interior toward the coast in a relentless search for sustenance.
We need to pause and be extraordinarily precise about the biology of the adversary here.
Please do, because the popular modern perception of the emu is heavily skewed.
Right, we view them as slightly goofy, oversized, flightless novelties.
And that perception does zero justice to the evolutionary reality of the Dromaeus nova hollandi.
Tell me about it.
This animal is, for all practical purposes, a surviving theropod dinosaur. We are talking about a creature that routinely stands 6 feet tall and weighs upward of 130 pounds of pure, dense muscle and bone.
But the sheer size is not the threat, right? The threat is the biomechanics.
Precisely. Their evolutionary engineering is terrifyingly optimized for the Australian outback. Their pelvic structure and muscular density allow them to sustain sprinting speeds between 30 and 50 kilometers per hour.
That is over 30 miles per hour over rough, unbroken terrain.
Furthermore, because they lack the heavy, restrictive musculature required for flight, their center of gravity and leg articulation allows them to execute full-speed, 90-degree turns almost instantaneously.
Wait, at full sprint?
Yes. They use a single vestigial wing as a counterbalance to pivot mid-stride. They are highly adapted, heavily armored survival machines, capable of enduring brutal extremes of temperature and dehydration.
Okay, so take 20,000 of these survival machines, suffering from severe dehydration and starvation, and march them across the continent.
In centuries past, a migration of this scale would have simply passed through the western regions, or the weaker members of the flock would have perished in the harsh scrubland.
But the landscape had changed. Remember the monumental effort the veterans put into taming the wheat belt?
Right, in their desperate bid to survive, the humans had inadvertently terraformed the environment into an absolute paradise for the emu.
This is the hidden trap of human infrastructure. You alter an ecosystem to serve one specific purpose, completely blind to how other species might leverage that alteration.
How did they leverage it?
Well, the veterans had clear-cut the dense, restrictive scrub, creating vast, wide-open corridors that were absolutely perfect for a sprinting, flightless bird.
Oh.
Yeah, and they had dug wells and installed hundreds of artificial water troughs to sustain their livestock, inadvertently creating permanent oases in a historically dry region.
And, most importantly, they had planted thousands upon thousands of acres of highly nutritious, easily digestible wheat.
Exactly. When the migrating horde of 20,000 emus crested the horizon and looked down upon the wheat belt, they did not see a human settlement.
They saw a neon, flashing beacon, an endless all-you-can-eat buffet meticulously prepared for them in the middle of a dying desert.
And an animal driven by the raw imperative of survival does not politely graze. It consumes.
The emus operated as a decentralized biological bulldozer. The sheer caloric intake of 20,000 massive birds devouring the wheat was devastating enough, but the collateral damage was far more insidious.
Right. A flock of that density moving through an agricultural zone doesn't just eat the crop. They crush it into the dirt. They snap the stalks. They contaminate the water supplies.
And then there was the systemic destruction of the frontier infrastructure itself. They collided directly with the rabbit-proof fences.
The rabbit-proof fence. This is perhaps the most critical piece of infrastructure in this entire narrative.
Why is that so crucial?
For decades, Australian agriculture only existed because of massive, continent-spanning networks of wire fencing designed to hold back a different manufactured ecological disaster, the European wild rabbit.
Let's not forget how that started.
Right. In 1859, a wealthy settler named Thomas Austin imported 13 wild rabbits and released them onto his estate in Victoria simply because he missed the sporting hunts of England.
He wanted his new property to feel more aristocratic, right?
Yes. And those 13 rabbits, introduced to an environment with zero natural predators, exploded into a population of hundreds of millions, systematically devouring the continent's vegetation.
So the rabbit-proof fences in Western Australia were literally the only physical barrier standing between the veterans' fragile crops and total, Absolute annihilation by rodents.
So what happens when 20,130-pound living battering rams hit a wire fence designed to stop a 3-pound mammal?
Complete structural failure. The emus smashed through the fences with ease, leaving massive, gaping holes in their wake.
They not only devoured the wheat themselves, but they held the door open for the rabbits to flood in right behind them.
The destruction was exponential. In a matter of days, farms that took a decade of backbreaking labor to build were reduced to dust and ruined wire.
This brings us to a profound psychological and philosophical juncture. How do we, looking back, frame this event?
What do you mean?
Well, from a purely biological perspective, this is a tragedy of ecological intersection. The emus harbor no malice. They are acting on a hardwired evolutionary code to seek water during a drought.
Right, they are victims of the changing climate and human land alteration just as much as the farmers are.
But step out of the academic perspective, put yourself in the boots of the veteran.
To the men on the ground, this was not an abstract ecological event.
No, to a man who has survived the trenches, who is drowning in debt, whose government has abandoned him, and who is watching his children face imminent starvation, the arrival of 20,000 massive creatures destroying everything he has built is not a conservation issue.
It is a literal active invasion.
Exactly. These men were conditioned by the military to view existential threats through the lens of organized conflict.
When your territory is overrun, your infrastructure is shattered, and your survival is on the line, you don't call an agricultural consultant, you call the army.
And that is precisely the warp in logic where this story descends into pure absurdity.
Right, because in any normal civic structure, a farmer facing an agricultural pest petitions the Ministry of Agriculture.
They request subsidies for reinforced fencing or perhaps state-funded culling programs or prisons.
But the veterans in Western Australia harbored a deep, entirely justified distrust of the agricultural bureaucracy following the subsidy betrayal.
They felt the civilian government was fundamentally illegitimate.
So, bypassing the Ministry of Agriculture entirely, a delegation of these veterans drew upon their old command structures and took their grievance directly to the Federal Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce.
And they did not ask for fences. They explicitly requested the deployment of military-grade machine guns.
I need to interrupt the timeline right here because the bureaucratic mechanics of this decision are just baffling.
They really are.
How does a Minister of Defense, a man tasked with the sovereign security of a nation, look at a request to use federal taxpayer funds, military personnel, and weapons of war to shoot birds in a wheat field and actually approve it?
Because he wasn't looking at an agricultural problem. He was looking at a political crisis.
Ah, exactly. The hidden implication. The Lions government was deeply unpopular.
Very. The veteran population was angry, highly mobilized, fully capable of violence, and incredibly vocal about the betrayal they had suffered over the wheat prices.
The state needed a pressure release valve.
So Sir George Pierce looked at the emu crisis and saw a golden public relations opportunity.
By deploying the military, he could posture as the decisive, action-oriented savior.
Exactly. He could project state power, validate the veterans' military identities, and completely distract the press from the underlying economic failures.
It was a calculated, highly cynical performance of state theater.
It was pure political pantomime, and the casting was immaculate.
So who did he send?
Sir George Pierce authorized the deployment of a specialized detachment from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery.
That sounds incredibly intimidating.
It does, but the operation was placed under the tactical command of Major Gwynedd Purves Wyn Aubrey Meredith. Despite the grand titles, the actual personnel deployed consisted of just 3 men.
3 men.
Yes, Major Meredith, Sergeant S. McMurray, and Gunner J. O'Halloran.
Now, on paper, 3 men sounds like a token gesture, not an army. But we have to analyze the specific arsenal they brought with them.
Right, they did not arrive with hunting rifles.
They were equipped with 2 World War I-era Lewis machine guns. We must unpack the brutal mechanics of the Lewis gun to understand the staggering arrogance of the military command.
Go ahead, break it down.
The military genuinely believed this would be a trivial exercise, entirely because of this specific weapon. The Lewis gun is a masterpiece of early 20th century mechanized violence.
It has a very distinct look, right?
Yes, it features a highly distinctive top-mounted circular pan magazine and a massive thick cooling shroud encasing the barrel. This shroud uses the muzzle blast to draw cool air over the fins, allowing for sustained, relentless rapid fire.
It is capable of discharging 500 rounds of .303 caliber military ammunition every single minute.
It fires a massive projectile designed to shatter bone and pierce rudimentary armor. It is not a tool for hunting game. It is an instrument of mass suppression.
It was engineered to be mounted on the muddy lip of a trench in Flanders and used to physically cut down waves of advancing human infantry.
It is literally designed to turn dense clusters of flesh into mist.
So the military command ran a simple arithmetic equation. If one Lewis gun can halt a battalion of German infantry, 2 Lewis guns will easily eradicate a flock of flightless birds.
And they shipped 10,000 rounds of ammunition with a detachment, assuming that would be more than enough to break the back of the migration.
The confidence emanating from the Defense Ministry was absolute.
It was so total that they didn't just deploy weapons, they deployed a film crew.
Yes. A cinematographer from Fox Movietone News was embedded with Major Meredith's unit.
The government fully intended to capture this glorious, mechanized slaughter on celluloid, rushing the footage back to cinemas in Sydney and Melbourne to play in the newsreels as a triumphant propaganda victory.
Man-conquering nature, courtesy of the state.
They had absolutely no idea they were marching into a profoundly humbling, highly publicized defeat.
And the unraveling of human superiority began almost the second boots hit the dirt. Let's dissect the first major skirmish.
This takes place on November 10th, 1932, right? Near the settlement of Campion.
Correct. Major Meredith's unit arrives, sets up their firing positions, and spots a vanguard group of approximately 50 emus moving through the scrub in the distance.
And what was the tactical plan?
It was rudimentary, but logically sound based on human hunting methods. The local farmers would act as beaters, forming a wide perimeter and driving the emus toward the concealed machine gun nests, where the soldiers would mow them down en masse.
But what actually happens to the physics of the battlefield when you attempt to assert human control over a flock of wild animals?
Total, immediate systemic breakdown.
An emu is not a sheep. It does not possess a herd instinct designed to cluster together when threatened.
No. The moment the farmers began making noise and attempting to corral the birds, the flock instantly scattered.
They did not bunch up into a dense target. They exploded outward in a dozen different erratic trajectories.
The soldiers, desperate to secure first blood on camera, opened fire.
But because the flock had fragmented so violently, the gunners found themselves firing at rapidly moving isolated targets that were already pushing beyond the effective range of the weapon.
The heavy, sweeping, suppressing fire of the Lewis gun, the very tactic that made it so lethal in Europe, achieved almost nothing.
A handful of birds fell, but the vast majority simply shifted into high gear, easily outpacing the tracking speed of the heavy guns.
They vanished into the scrub at 30 miles per hour, completely unfazed by the deafening noise of the artillery.
This is where we see a spectacular failure of tactical imagination. The military brought a tool explicitly designed for static trench warfare.
Right.
In a trench environment, the enemy is forced into a dense, clustered formation by the geography of the battlefield. The front line is a rigid, solid structure.
And the Lewis gun applies sheer kinetic force against that solid structure to break it.
But the emu flock operated under completely different physical laws. Think about fluid dynamics. If you fire a machine gun into a brick wall, the wall shatters.
Okay.
But if you fire a machine gun into a rushing river, the water does not break. It simply parts around the impact and continues flowing.
Wow, that is a perfect analogy. The emus acted as a biological fluid.
Their decentralized, chaotic dispersal patterns mathematically negated the advantage of rapid-fire ballistics. The military was expending highly expensive ammunition trying to shoot water.
Recognizing that their initial doctrine was flawed, Major Meredith and his two-man crew recalibrated. 2 days later, on November 4, local intelligence alerted them to a massive concentration of the enemy.
How many are we talking about here?
Roughly 1,000 emus were converging on a local dam to drink. This was the exact scenario the military had been praying for.
A massive, densely packed target, distracted by a biological necessity.
This time they discarded the idea of using the farmers to herd them. They opted for stealth. The soldiers quietly moved into position, setting up a lethal ambush in the brush right at the edge of the dam.
They settled in behind the Lewis guns and waited.
It is the textbook definition of a flawless military ambush.
You have an unsuspecting enemy. You have massive concentrated numbers. You have a stationary target. You possess overwhelming rapid-fire superiority.
And most crucially, you have the discipline to wait until the birds are at absolute point-blank range. From a tactical standpoint, you literally cannot miss.
So what happens?
The flock approaches the water. Major Meredith gives the signal. Gunner O'Halloran pulls the trigger. The Lewis gun roars to life, spitting high-caliber death into the densely packed birds.
Man.
Approximately 12 emus are instantly cut down, collapsing into the dirt. And then a sickening metallic clack echoes over the dam. The gun jams.
Wait, a mechanical failure at the exact moment of engagement.
Total mechanical failure. A stoppage in the firing mechanism silences the weapon instantly.
In the frantic, terrifying seconds it takes the soldiers to realize what has happened, open the breech, and attempt to clear the jammed cartridge, the biological reality of the flock reacts.
The remaining 988 emus don't stand there confused.
No, they explode into a frantic, chaotic sprint, instantly scattering in every conceivable direction, vanishing into the dense scrub before the gun can be brought back online.
The flawless ambush was an unmitigated disaster.
Look at the sheer irony of that moment. The greatest technological advantage the human forces possessed, the complex, mechanized rapid-fire action of the machine gun, was completely defeated by a single piece of grit or a misaligned cartridge at the worst possible microsecond.
The rigidity of the machine failed, and the fluidity of the biological organism capitalized on it instantly.
The frustration among those men must have been suffocating. You are highly trained artillerymen. You have an overwhelming technological advantage, and you are being systematically outmaneuvered and humiliated by birds.
So, like any military force facing a mobile insurgency, they attempt to escalate. They decide that if static ambushes are failing because the enemy is too fast, the military must become fast.
They execute the truck experiment.
Yes, they physically mount one of the heavy Lewis guns onto the back tray of a civilian pursuit truck.
The logic appears sound on a whiteboard, right? Mobile warfare. You mount the artillery, you chase the target down, and you fire on the move. But once again, what are they failing to account for?
The physical reality of the Earth itself. They are applying European road logic to the Australian outback.
The terrain in the wheat belt is not a paved highway.
No, it is incredibly rough, uneven, punishing terrain filled with hidden rocks, deep ruts, and dense root systems.
And the emu possesses a biological suspension system refined over millions of years, capable of absorbing that terrain effortlessly while sprinting at 30 miles per hour.
The heavy truck, conversely, is a rigid metal box bounding violently over the rocks. It simply cannot accelerate fast enough or maintain the speed required to catch the flock.
And what happens to the gunner in the back of a truck moving over that kind of terrain?
The gunner is essentially being tossed around like laundry in a washing machine.
The ride is so violently erratic that the soldier physically cannot brace himself, let alone steady the massive Lewis gun enough to aim.
He is desperately holding on for dear life, completely incapable of firing a single accurate shot.
It is the perfect visual microcosm of the entire war. The human machine is heavy, rigid, bound by the limitations of its engineering, and violently clashing with the environment.
While the biological organism is adaptable, resilient, and flowing perfectly through its native habitat.
And it gets worse.
It does. There is a specific incident during this truck phase that elevates the conflict from merely absurd to genuinely unbelievable.
What happened?
Major Meredith is in the truck, barreling through the scrub, desperately trying to close the distance on a fleeing group of emus. Suddenly, one of the massive birds cuts violently across the path of the speeding vehicle.
Oh no!
The driver slams on the brakes, but the momentum is too great. The heavy truck plows directly into the bird.
Now, basic physics suggests the bird is crushed under the wheels, right?
No. The sheer mass and bone density of the emu alters the physics of the crash. Instead of being run over, the body of the massive bird becomes horribly, inextricably tangled in the front steering mechanism of the vehicle.
You are kidding.
The carcass literally jams the steering arm. The steering wheel violently locks up in the driver's hands. The driver loses total control of the military pursuit vehicle, veers wildly off the dirt track, and smashes directly into a massive line of fencing, destroying the truck and nearly killing the men inside.
Wait. Stop. Are you telling me the bird didn't just survive the initial chase, but its body actively disabled the steering column of the pursuit vehicle?
Yes.
You literally have a human military truck being taken out in a kamikaze maneuver by a flightless bird. The animal weaponized its own mass to destroy the machine hunting it.
Exactly. Let's signpost where we are in the narrative for a second. You have desperate, bankrupt veterans facing a biological tide that is consuming their only means of survival.
You have a cynical government attempting to solve an ecological nightmare with a public relations stunt.
And you have highly trained soldiers, wielding weapons of mass destruction, completely paralyzed by a flock of birds that scatter like water, outrun combustion engines, and accidentally destroy military vehicles with their own corpses.
It is a profound philosophical humiliation of state power.
And compounding that humiliation is the terrifying physical reality of the emus themselves.
We have established that they were hard to hit because of their speed and fluid movement. But what happens when the soldiers actually manage to land a shot? What happens when a .303 caliber military round strikes the bird?
This is where the historical accounts shift from military debriefs to something resembling mythological horror. Often, absolutely nothing happens.
Nothing.
The soldiers would watch in horror as an emu would take a direct hit from a high-powered rifle round, stumble for a fraction of a second, and simply keep running.
The anatomy of the emu acts as a bizarre form of biological armor.
Yeah, they possess incredibly dense, thick plumage that dampens the kinetic energy of the bullet, hiding their vital organs deep within the mass.
Furthermore, the heavy layers of fat beneath the skin seem to act almost like a self-sealing fuel tank, closing around the entry wound and preventing catastrophic blood loss.
The psychological impact of seeing your weapons fail so completely must have broken the morale of the men.
Major Meredith himself was left in a state of absolute traumatized awe. His quotes from the debriefs are legendary.
What did he say?
He went on the official record to state, and I quote, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They are like Zulus whom even dum-dum bullets could not stop."
Let that statement breathe. A seasoned military commander, a man who understands the mechanized slaughter of the First World War, is looking at a bird and comparing its physical resilience to heavily armored combat vehicles.
Another soldier bleakly noted in his report that the only reliable way to guarantee a kill on an emu was to shoot it squarely through the back of the head while its mouth was closed. Center mass shots with military hardware were simply not enough.
But the physical invulnerability was only one half of the equation. The other half involves what the soldiers interpreted as emergent intelligence.
Right, the observers began reporting deeply unsettling behavioral adaptations within the flocks. As the human harassment continued, the massive horde of 20,000 did not stay clumped together.
They began to strategically fragment into smaller, highly manageable units.
And within these units, a distinct hierarchy seemed to emerge. Soldiers noted that every small flock appeared to have a designated watchman.
This was invariably a significantly taller, dark-feathered bird that refused to eat. It simply stood at attention, scanning the horizon.
The absolute second the watchman spotted the glint of a rifle or the movement of a soldier, it would sound a harsh alarm call, and the entire flock would instantly scatter miles before the slow-moving Lewis guns could even be brought into position.
The military essentially claimed the birds were utilizing coordinated guerrilla warfare.
But is that a fair assessment? We must be rigorously skeptical here.
Why do you say that?
Are we genuinely witnessing a flock of birds developing a military command structure and executing coordinated evasion tactics? Or are we simply watching a highly evolved prey species exhibit deeply hardwired, natural survival behaviors?
And the profoundly humiliated human soldiers eagerly anthropomorphize them to excuse their own tactical incompetence.
Exactly. It is far easier for a proud military officer to tell the press, "We were defeated because the enemy is a tactical genius," rather than admitting, "I expended thousands of rounds of taxpayer ammunition and couldn't shoot a bird in an open field."
Regardless of whether it was genuine emergent strategy or simply raw survival instinct, the mathematical reality of the battlefield remained identical. The military was being utterly outmaneuvered.
By the end of the first week of November, a horrific arithmetic emerged.
The detachment had fired approximately 2,500 rounds of military-grade ammunition.
And the confirmed kill count.
Depending on which embarrassed official was reporting, it was anywhere from a meager 50 to perhaps 200 birds, out of an invading force of 20,000.
The math is devastating. It is statistically irrelevant. You're expending vast amounts of expensive, highly engineered resources to achieve absolutely nothing.
And a failure of that magnitude cannot be contained.
The global press, who had initially reported on the deployment with a sense of quirky novelty, suddenly smelled blood in the water.
The narrative violently shifted. It was no longer a story of man conquering nature. It was a story of a modern military being made a global laughingstock by poultry.
By November 8th, the story had violently ricocheted back into the halls of the Australian Parliament, and the political backlash was savage.
The political theater collapsed inward. The very PR stunt Sir George Pierce engineered to save his reputation became the weapon used to destroy it.
Members of Parliament from opposing factions openly mocked the operation on the floor. A rival politician cruelly and permanently dubbed Pierce the Minister of the Emu War.
The ridicule spilled across international borders. The story hit the papers in London.
Conservationists in the United Kingdom were reading these dispatches and reacting with a volatile mixture of profound ethical outrage over the mass slaughter of wildlife and deep condescending amusement at the sheer, staggering incompetence of the Australian military apparatus.
The political pressure became unbearable. Sir George Pierce, humiliated, utterly lacking any defensible metrics of success, officially ordered Major Meredith to withdraw his forces on November 8th.
The humans retreated. The emus had definitively won the first battle.
But a political retreat does not alter the physical reality on the ground.
The politicians in Sydney could laugh, and the aristocrats in London could write angry letters, but the veteran farmers in Western Australia were still standing in the dirt, watching their future be methodically eaten.
The biological tide had not receded. The state had initiated a conflict, failed spectacularly, and then abandoned its citizens to the fallout.
The farmers, facing literal starvation, did what desperate people do. They immediately began petitioning the government to send the army right back.
And the political winds shifted yet again. The farmers found a powerful advocate in the Premier of Western Australia, James Mitchell.
He bypassed the mockery and argued forcefully that regardless of how absurd the situation looked in the press, the agricultural destruction was an existential crisis for the state economy and required immediate federal intervention.
The pressure mounted, the government relented, and on November 13th, Major Meredith and his gunners were ordered back into the wheat belt. The second phase of the war commenced.
This second phase is historically crucial because it strips away the grand illusions of the first week.
Yeah, there are no more Fox movie tone cameras. There are no more sweeping, glorious ambushes.
It devolved into a grim, grinding, deeply unglamorous war of attrition against an endlessly renewing biological resource.
For weeks, they engaged in a slow, brutal cull. But we must analyze the final tally to truly comprehend the futility of utilizing state military force against an ecosystem.
A campaign finally ground to a definitive halt, and the military withdrew for the final time on December 10, 1932.
Major Meredith filed his final official debrief. In it, he claimed exactly 986 confirmed kills. To achieve this number, he reported expending exactly 9,860 rounds of ammunition.
A mathematically perfect ratio. Exactly 10 bullets fired for every single confirmed dead bird.
He also appended a highly speculative, incredibly convenient claim that an additional 2,500 emus had subsequently died from their injuries, though contemporary historians and biological experts view that unverified number as pure fiction designed to salvage a career.
But let's accept his inflated numbers for a moment. Let's pretend they killed 3,000 birds.
They had barely scratched the surface of a population of 20,000.
The military packed up their ruined trucks, boxed up their jammed Lewis guns, and went home in defeat. The emus remained in the fields eating the wheat. The war was over.
But did the military actually lose in a physical sense?
I argue that the government didn't surrender to the emus, they surrendered to the accounting department.
You mean?
It wasn't that the Lewis gun was physically incapable of killing a bird. It was that the methodology, utilizing highly centralized, incredibly expensive, rapid-fire military logistics against a decentralized, hypermobile, infinitely regenerating target, was fundamentally unsustainable.
Ah, I see.
The cost-to-benefit ratio of fighting a war of attrition against nature was economically bankrupt. They realized you cannot solve an ecological imbalance by treating it like an advancing infantry battalion.
That is the grand unifying synthesis of this entire bizarre chapter of human history. The military failed so completely because they attempted to enforce a rigid, top-down technological solution onto a highly complex, infinitely adaptable ecological system.
They operated under the arrogant assumption that superior firepower could override biological reality. They thought they could shoot a drought.
It is the ultimate historical parable of human hubris. When you attempt to force the natural world into a human framework of logic, nature will simply flow around you, exhaust your capital, and leave you looking utterly foolish.
This raises the vital question. If centralized military intervention was a catastrophic failure of methodology, how did they actually solve the problem?
Because the farmers still existed and the wheat still needed protection.
Right. How do you manage a biological tide if you cannot shoot it into submission?
You have to fundamentally alter the incentive structure, and you have to adapt your architecture.
Exactly. The government finally learned its lesson. They abandoned the concept of top-down military force entirely Instead, they decentralized the response.
They instituted a massive bounty system. They took the very funds they had wasted on artillery and used it to empower the local farmers.
They placed the solution in the hands of the people who actually understood the terrain, who knew the migratory patterns of the birds, and who had a direct, visceral interest in the outcome.
And look at the difference between centralized military force and localized incentive. The results are staggering.
Once the state provided the financial bounty and subsidized the ammunition, the paradigm shifted.
In just a 6-month period in 1934, an astonishing 57,034 emu bounties were successfully claimed.
Over the next 15 years, from 1945 to 1960, nearly 300,000 emus were systematically culled.
The local farmers, utilizing patience, deep localized knowledge, and standard bolt-action rifles, achieved efficiently what the heavy machine guns of the military could not even dent.
But even that staggering level of localized culling wasn't the permanent solution. You cannot endlessly slaughter a native species year after year to protect a commercial crop.
At some point, you have to acknowledge the environment and change your own infrastructure.
The true, lasting victory wasn't won with bullets at all. It was won with barriers.
The government finally shifted its strategy from eradication to exclusion.
They invested massive capital into constructing hundreds of miles of highly specialized, reinforced pest exclusion fencing.
They built towering physical barriers, topped with barbed wire, designed not to kill the emus, but to physically alter their ancient migration patterns, keeping them entirely separated from the vulnerable agricultural zones.
The humans finally stopped trying to fight the biological tide, and instead they built a breakwater to redirect it.
And that leads us to the ultimate profound irony of this entire historical narrative. It is a realization that completely recontextualizes the hubris of 1932.
Decades after the federal government deployed heavy artillery in a desperate, frantic bid to eradicate the emus from the wheat belt, the cultural, scientific, and legal landscape of Australia underwent a fundamental evolution.
Today, the emu, the very animal that survived the machine guns, outran the pursuit trucks, outlasted the national bounty programs, and brought a military detachment to its knees, is a strictly protected species under the 1999 Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act.
Let the weight of that reality sink in. Nature endures. We brought the absolute zenith of our killing machines. We brought our political vanity. We brought our desperate economic anxiety, and we poured all of it onto that arid landscape.
And the emu survived it all.
It survived until human beings finally evolved their own ecological thinking. We transitioned from declaring a literal mechanized war on these creatures to passing massive federal legislation specifically designed to protect them from our own expansion.
It is a humbling, breathtaking testament to the absolute resilience of the biological world.
It forces you to look at the modern era through a profoundly different, perhaps unsettling lens.
We sit here today, insulated in our cities, surrounded by technology that makes a 1932 Lewis gun look like a crude child's toy.
We possess artificial intelligence, autonomous drones, genetic engineering, and climate manipulation.
We still operate under that exact same deeply intoxicating illusion that we are the absolute, unquestionable masters of our domain.
But the global climate is shifting rapidly. The ecological balance is trembling in ways we cannot easily model.
So I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought to explore on your own. When our modern, highly advanced infrastructure inevitably comes face-to-face with the next unavoidable, chaotic shift in the natural world, what will we do?
Will we blindly deploy our technological equivalent of machine guns, arrogant in the belief that sheer force is the only answer?
Or will we finally remember the humbling, absurd lesson learned in the dust of the Western Australian wheat fields?
It ultimately asks whether human civilization has truly learned to adapt its architecture to the planet, or if we're simply waiting in our fragile fortresses to be outmaneuvered by the next great biological tide.
Thank you for giving us your time today, and for exploring the profound depths of this history with us. If this discussion challenged your perspective, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We rely entirely on your support to keep bringing these vital narratives to light. Check the description below for reference links and more information. Until next time, keep elevating your mind.